Why smart people make bad decisions. 5 critical thinking strategies that will change everything. Introduction. The spark of curiosity. The rain tapped gently against the window of my favorite cafe, creating a soothing rhythm that matched the flow of thoughts in my mind. I stared at my laptop screen, trying to make sense of a project that had gone sideways despite my best efforts. My team had followed protocol precisely, analyzed the data thoroughly, and yet our conclusions had missed crucial elements that now seemed obvious in hindsight. Mind if I join you? A voice interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to see an elderly gentleman with kind eyes and a weathered face that spoke of years of experience. Something about his calm presence made me gesture to the empty chair across from me. "I'm Thomas," he said with a warm smile, setting down his cup of tea. "I couldn't help noticing your expression. Reminds me of myself years ago, stuck in a mental maze of my own making." That chance encounter with Thomas, a retired professor of cognitive psychology, would change how I approached not just that troubled project, but every challenge I'd face thereafter. What began as a casual conversation evolved into a profound journey into the art of critical thinking. Not the rigid, academic version I learned in school, but something far more dynamic, practical, and transformative. Critical thinking isn't just about logic and argument, Thomas told me that first day. It's about developing mental flexibility, the ability to see situations from multiple perspectives, to question your own assumptions, and to integrate both analytical reasoning and emotional intelligence. Over the months that followed, Thomas became my mentor, guiding me through what he called the enlightenment of the mind. Our weekly conversations at that same cafe table became a sanctuary where I could explore not just how to think better, but how to understand myself and others more deeply. In this book, I'll share that journey with you, the insights, strategies, and transformations that emerge from those conversations. Each chapter builds on the previous one, creating a comprehensive approach to developing critical thinking skills that work in real-world situations. This isn't a theoretical text filled with abstract concepts. Instead, it's a practical guide filled with stories, both mine and others, that illustrate how critical thinking can transform your approach to work challenges, personal relationships, and life decisions. I'll share the exercises Thomas gave me, the mistakes I made along the way, and the breakthroughs that changed my perspective. The chapters ahead will take us through various aspects of critical thinking, from understanding our own thought patterns to navigating emotional terrain, from questioning assumptions to cultivating mental flexibility. We'll explore how to apply these skills to tough decisions, complex problems, and challenging relationships. As Thomas often reminded me, critical thinking isn't a destination, but a journey, one that never really ends. Each chapter of this book represents a step in that journey, offering practical tools and insights you can apply immediately to your own challenges. So join me as we explore the art of thinking clearly, communicating effectively, and navigating life's complexities with greater wisdom and understanding. Whether you're facing workplace dilemmas, personal crossroads, or simply seeking to sharpen your mental capabilities, this book offers a roadmap for developing the kind of flexible, nuanced thinking that can transform how you see the world and your place in it. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Foundations of Critical Thinking. The problem, Thomas said, stirring his tea thoughtfully, isn't that people don't think. It's that they don't know how to examine how they think. It was our second meeting at the cafe, and I just shared my frustration about a team member who seemed resistant to every new idea I proposed. Rain continued to fall outside, creating a cocoon of privacy around our corner table. "What do you mean?" I asked, puzzled by his statement. "Most of us go through life believing our perspectives are objective reality," Thomas explained. "We rarely stop to consider that our thoughts are shaped by countless invisible influences: our upbringing, culture, education, experiences, and even our current emotional state." I remember my latest clash with Mike, the senior analyst on my team. I presented what I thought was a brilliant approach to our data analytics project, only to have him immediately point out flaws and push back on every suggestion. "Take this colleague you mentioned," Thomas continued, as if reading my thoughts. You're seeing him as stubborn and resistant to innovation. But what if we explored other possibilities? What might be behind his responses? This simple question marked my first step into true critical thinking. Thomas guided me through an exercise he called perspective mapping, exploring different ways of interpreting the same situation. What if Mike isn't resistant to change, but concerned about risks you haven't considered? What if his previous experiences make him cautious in ways that could actually benefit the project? What if his pushback isn't personal, but professional, a way of testing the strength of your ideas? Each question opened a new angle I hadn't considered, making me realize how quickly I'd jumped to conclusions about Mike's motives. I'd labeled him as resistant, without exploring the reasoning behind his concerns. Critical thinking begins with awareness, Thomas explained. Awareness of your own thought patterns, of the assumptions you're making, and of the lens through which you're viewing situations. Mental models, the invisible architects of thought. Over the next several weeks, Thomas introduced me to the concept of mental models, the frameworks we use to understand and interpret the world around us. Think of mental models as the maps you use to navigate reality, he said. They're incredibly useful, essential, even, but no map perfectly represents the territory it describes. He explained how we all develop these internal maps based on our experiences, education, and cultural background. They help us make sense of new information quickly, but they can also limit our perspective if we forget that the map isn't the territory. I began to recognize some of my own mental models in action. As a technology professional with an engineering background, I tended to prioritize efficiency and innovation. When faced with a problem, I automatically looked for the newest, most efficient solution. Mike, with his background in risk management, naturally focused on potential pitfalls and vulnerabilities. Neither approach is inherently right or wrong, Thomas pointed out. They're just different maps of the same territory, each highlighting different features while obscuring others. This insight transformed how I approached my next meeting with Mike. Instead of trying to convince him that my approach was right, I asked questions that helped me understand his perspective. What concerns do you have about this approach? What risks should we be considering? His responses surprised me. Far from being blindly resistant, Mike had identified several legitimate vulnerabilities in my proposal, issues that, once addressed, actually strengthened the final solution. By exploring his mental model rather than dismissing it, we developed an approach that incorporated the best of both our perspectives. The foundation skills, observation and analysis. The most basic skills of critical thinking, Thomas told me during one of our sessions, are careful observation and thoughtful analysis. But most people are surprisingly poor observers of both external events and their own thought processes. He guided me through a simple exercise to demonstrate this point. For the next 2 minutes, pay attention to everything you can observe in this cafe. Sights, sounds, smells, sensations. Then we'll compare notes. After 2 minutes, I shared my observations. The rain on the windows, the hiss of the espresso machine, the conversation at the next table, the aroma of coffee. Thomas nodded. Now, what thoughts and feelings did you notice while you were observing? This question caught me off guard. I've been focused entirely on external observations, not on my internal state. Thomas smiled knowingly. This is where most of us have a blind spot. We're rarely aware of our own thought processes as they happen. Yet true critical thinking requires this kind of meta-awareness, the ability to observe not just the world around us, but our own minds in action. He introduced me to a practice he called thought noting, taking brief moments throughout the day to observe my thoughts without judgment. What assumptions was I making? What emotions were influencing my thinking? What mental models was I applying to the situation? The practice was challenging at first. I'd find myself deep in analysis of a problem before remembering to step back and observe my own thinking. But gradually, it became more natural, creating small spaces of awareness between stimulus and response. From reaction to response, the critical thinking gap. The most powerful moment in critical thinking, Thomas explained, is the gap between stimulus and response, between when something happens and how you react to it. He drew a simple diagram on napkin. Stimulus, gap, response. Most people's gaps are milliseconds long. Something happens, and they react almost automatically, driven by habits, emotions, and unconscious mental models. Critical thinking is about expanding that gap, creating space to observe, question, and choose your response rather than simply reacting. This concept hit home during a high-pressure meeting the following week. Our team was presenting findings to senior leadership when a vice president aggressively questioned our methodology. I felt a familiar surge of defensiveness rising, my body tensing as I prepared to counter his criticism. But remembering Thomas's diagram, I intentionally paused. In that small gap, I observed my defensive reaction and the assumptions behind it, that the VP was attacking our competence, that I needed to protect our team's reputation, that this was a confrontation rather than an inquiry. Instead of reacting defensively, I took a breath and asked, "Could you help me understand your specific concerns about our approach?" His response revealed that he wasn't questioning our competence at all. He was trying to understand how to apply our methodology to another division's challenges. That small gap between stimulus and response completely changed the dynamic of the interaction. Instead of a confrontation, it became a collaborative discussion about broader applications of our work. The practice of curiosity. If I had to identify the single most important quality for critical thinking, Thomas said during one of our later sessions, it would be genuine curiosity. Not the superficial curiosity that seeks to confirm what you already believe, but the deep curiosity that's willing to be surprised, challenged, even proven wrong. This kind of curiosity, he explained, is both an attitude and a skill, something we can cultivate through deliberate practice. He suggested a simple exercise. Whenever I encountered a perspective different from my own, I should ask at least 3 genuine questions before offering any opinion. Not rhetorical questions designed to poke holes in their thinking, he clarified. Real questions that help you understand how they see the world. I began practicing this with Mike, asking questions about his approach to risk assessment. What factors did he consider most important? How had his previous experiences shaped his perspective? What would an ideal solution look like from his viewpoint? His answers revealed a depth of expertise and insight I had completely missed. He wasn't resistant to innovation. He was committed to sustainable innovation, changes that would endure because they addressed potential vulnerabilities up front. This practice of curiosity gradually extended beyond work. When my partner and I disagreed about financial decisions, I found myself asking more questions and making fewer assumptions. When friends expressed political views different from mine, I became more interested in understanding their reasoning than in proving them wrong. Integration, the heart of critical thinking. As our first month of meetings drew to a close, Thomas shared what he considered the ultimate goal of critical thinking. Many people believe critical thinking is about becoming more logical, more rational, he said. But that's only part of the picture. True critical thinking is about integration, bringing together different ways of knowing and understanding. He explained how the most effective thinkers integrate analytical reasoning with emotional intelligence, individual perspective with collective wisdom, concrete data with intuitive insight. The world's most complex problems won't be solved by logic alone or by emotion alone, he said. They require the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to see both the forest and the trees, to understand both the parts and the whole. This concept of integration would become central to my understanding of critical thinking, not as a dry, academic exercise, but as a rich, multidimensional approach to navigating life's complexities. As I left the cafe that day, watching the rain give way to patches of sunlight, I realized that my understanding of thinking itself had begun to transform. What had started as a desire to solve a specific work problem was evolving into something much more profound, a journey toward a more integrated, aware, and flexible mind. Little did I know how deeply this foundation would be tested in the challenges that lay ahead. Chapter 2. Overcoming the Illusion of Certainty. Tell me, Thomas asked, as we settled into our usual corner of the cafe the following month, about a time when you were absolutely certain about something, only to discover later that you were wrong. I thought for a moment, then shared a story from early in my career. I'd been convinced that a particular technological approach was the only viable solution for a critical project. I'd advocated for it passionately, dismissing alternative suggestions. 6 months and thousands of development hours later, we discovered fundamental flaws that made the approach unworkable. We had to start over, wasting valuable time and resources. Thomas nodded, his eyes reflecting understanding rather than judgment. The illusion of certainty, he said, is perhaps the greatest obstacle to critical thinking. We crave certainty. It makes us feel safe, competent, in control. But that very craving can blind us to alternatives, evidence, and possibilities that might lead to better outcomes. The comfort of closed minds. Think about what happens physiologically when you encounter information that contradicts your existing beliefs, Thomas continued. Research shows that it can trigger the same brain regions associated with physical threat. On some level, we experience challenges to our certainty as threats to our safety. I remembered the defensive tension I'd felt whenever someone questioned my chosen approach on that failed project. The tightness in my chest, the rush of arguments to my mind, the subtle narrowing of my attention to focus only on information that supported my position. That's why truly open thinking requires courage, Thomas said. It means being willing to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty, to hold our beliefs more loosely, to see them as provisional rather than absolute. This was easier said than done, I discovered over the following weeks. During a strategic planning session at work, I found myself becoming increasingly rigid about a particular market assessment, dismissing data that didn't align with my analysis. It wasn't until a colleague gently asked, "What would change your mind about this?" that I recognized my certainty hardening into dogma. The question stopped me short. I realized I couldn't easily answer it, a clear sign that I had moved from evidence-based confidence to inflexible certainty. Certainty signals, recognizing the warning signs. Thomas introduced me to what he called certainty signals, indicators that we've slipped from thoughtful confidence into the illusion of certainty. Dismissing contradictory evidence without consideration. Using absolute language, always, never, impossible. Feeling emotionally triggered by questioning. Unable to articulate what would change your mind. Viewing the issue in binary terms rather than seeing nuances. I began noticing these signals in myself and others. During a heated debate about resource allocation, I caught myself using increasingly absolute language. This approach will never work, I heard myself say, and recognized the certainty signal immediately. I paused, created that critical gap between stimulus and response, and adjusted. I have serious concerns about this approach based on X, Y, and Z factors. The subtle shift from absolute certainty to evidence-based concern completely changed the conversation's dynamic. Instead of triggering defensiveness, it opened space for collaborative problem-solving. The practice of humble confidence. The alternative to rigid certainty isn't wishy-washy indecision, Thomas explained during one of our conversations. It's what I call humble confidence, the ability to hold strong views weakly. This paradoxical idea fascinated me. Thomas elaborated. Holding strong views weakly means being clear and confident about your current position based on the best evidence and reasoning available to you, while simultaneously remaining open to new information that might change your mind. He introduced me to a practice for developing this quality, which he called pre-mortem thinking. Before firmly committing to a position or decision, ask yourself, if this turns out to be wrong, what would likely have been the cause? What evidence might I be overlooking? What alternative explanations haven't I considered? I began applying this practice to both work and personal decisions. Before finalizing a major technology investment recommendation, I explicitly considered what factors might make it fail. This exercise led me to identify several overlooked risks and develop contingency plans, ultimately strengthening the proposal. In my personal life, when considering a move to a new neighborhood, the pre-mortem thinking helped me recognize that I was undervaluing the importance of my existing community connections. This didn't change my decision, but it did lead me to create specific plans for maintaining important relationships after the move. The illusion of explanatory depth. One of the most fascinating aspects of certainty, Thomas told me during a particularly insightful session, is what psychologists call the illusion of explanatory depth. We believe we understand things far better than we actually do. He described studies where people rated their understanding of everyday objects like zippers or toilets quite highly, but when asked to explain in detail how these things actually worked, suddenly realized the gaps in their understanding. This applies to our political beliefs, our organizational theories, our relationship assumptions. We think we understand why things work the way they do, but that understanding is often superficial. True critical thinking requires humility about the limits of our knowledge. This concept hit home during a team discussion about customer behavior patterns. I had been confidently asserting why certain features weren't being adopted, but when a new team member innocently asked me to explain the mechanism behind my theory, I realized my explanation was largely circular and assumption-based rather than evidence-driven. That moment of recognizing my own illusion of understanding was uncomfortable but transformative. It led me to initiate a proper customer research study rather than relying on plausible-sounding explanations that lacked solid foundation. From debate to dialogue, the language of exploration. Notice how our language shifts when we move from certainty to exploration, Thomas observed. Debate language focuses on proving points, defending positions, winning arguments. Dialogue language focuses on understanding, discovery, and collaborative learning. He suggested experimenting with more tentative, exploratory language when discussing complex issues. I'm thinking that. Instead of this is based on what I've seen. Instead of the fact is I'm curious about. Instead of you're wrong about. These subtle shifts in language open new possibilities in my interactions. During a particularly challenging negotiation with a vendor, I consciously shifted from debate language, your timeline is unacceptable, to dialogue language. I'm concerned about how this timeline might impact our customers. Can we explore options that would address both our needs? The change in approach led to a creative solution neither of us had initially considered. A phased implementation that met both our core requirements. The certainty spectrum, matching confidence to evidence. As our discussions continued, Thomas introduced me to the concept of the certainty spectrum, the idea that appropriate levels of confidence should match the strength of available evidence. In some areas, high levels of certainty are justified when evidence is abundant, consistent, and has survived rigorous testing. In others, where evidence is limited or contradictory, lower confidence is more appropriate. The problem comes when our certainty level doesn't match the evidence. He drew a simple diagram showing different knowledge domains arranged along a spectrum from strong evidence justifying high certainty to limited evidence requiring tentative views. This framework helped me calibrate my confidence levels in different areas. In technical domains where I had deep expertise and abundant data, confident assertions were appropriate. In areas like market prediction or user behavior, where evidence was typically more limited and variable, more tentative language and greater openness to alternatives better matched the reality of what we actually knew. The paradox of expertise. One of the great paradoxes of critical thinking, Thomas shared during our final session on certainty, is that as people become more knowledgeable in their field, they often become both more confident and more aware of the limits of their knowledge. He described how true experts typically use more nuanced, qualified language than novices, who often speak in more absolute terms. Experts understand the complexity of their domain and the provisional nature of knowledge within it. This insight helped me recognize when self-proclaimed experts might actually have limited depth of understanding. Those who spoke in absolutes, dismissed complexities, and showed no awareness of the limitations of current knowledge in their field. It also challenged me to develop this paradoxical quality in my own areas of expertise, to combine deep knowledge with humble awareness of what remains unknown or uncertain. From certainty to curiosity, a personal transformation. As I walked out of the cafe after a final discussion on certainty, I realized how profoundly my relationship with knowledge and beliefs had shifted over the past weeks. Where once I had sought the comfort of certainty, I now found greater peace in curiosity. Rather than feeling threatened by perspectives that challenge my views, I became genuinely interested in what I might learn from them. The world had become not a place to be confidently explained, but a complex reality to be continuously explored. This shift didn't mean abandoning conviction or falling into relativism. Instead, it meant holding my beliefs with an open hand rather than a clenched fist, strong enough to act upon, flexible enough to revise in light of new evidence. Little did I know how crucial this new relationship with certainty would prove in navigating the unexpected crisis that lay just around the corner. Chapter 3. Navigating Emotional Waters. The Heart of Critical Thinking. The cafe seemed unusually quiet as I arrived for my next meeting with Thomas. Snow was falling gently outside, creating a sense of hushed anticipation. I had just experienced one of the most emotionally challenging weeks of my professional life. A critical project had hit major obstacles, team tensions were running high, and I'd found myself struggling to think clearly amid the stress and conflict. Thomas seemed to read my state of mind as I sat down. "You look troubled," he observed, his voice gentle. "Tell me what's happening." As I described the situation, I found myself growing increasingly emotional, surprising myself with the intensity of my feelings. I finished with an apologetic smile. "Sorry for the emotional download. I know critical thinking is supposed to be about logic and rationality." Thomas's response surprised me. "Actually," he said, pouring tea for both of us, "this brings us to one of the most misunderstood aspects of critical thinking, the role of emotions. Many people believe critical thinking means suppressing emotions in favor of pure logic. Nothing could be further from the truth. The emotional dimension of thought. Emotions are not the enemy of clear thinking," Thomas continued. "They're an essential component of it. They provide crucial information, motivate action, and help us connect with others. The key isn't to eliminate emotions from our thinking process, but to understand them and work with them skillfully." He explained how neuroscience has shown that people with damage to emotional centers of the brain don't become perfect reasoning machines. Instead, they struggle to make even simple decisions, lacking the emotional guidance that helps prioritize options and choices. "Think of emotions as messengers," he suggested. "They're carrying information that's important for you to understand about your values, your needs, your unexamined assumptions. When we try to suppress them, we lose access to that information." This perspective challenged my long-held belief that professional decisions should be made on purely rational grounds. I'd often prided myself on keeping emotions out of workplace decisions, or at least I thought I had. "The truth," Thomas said, seeming to read my thoughts again, "is that emotions always influence our thinking, whether we acknowledge them or not. The question is whether that influence happens unconsciously, potentially distorting our thinking, or whether we bring it into awareness where we can learn from it." Emotional awareness, the first step. Thomas introduced me to a practice he called emotional auditing, taking regular moments throughout the day to notice and name what I was feeling without judgment. "Many of us have poor emotional vocabulary," he explained. "We recognize only basic emotions like anger, fear, or happiness, missing the rich subtleties that could provide more precise information." He shared a more nuanced emotional vocabulary, distinguishing, for example, between anxiety, fear about future uncertainties, dread, fear of a specific anticipated event, and apprehension, mild worry combined with heightened awareness. When you can name an emotion precisely, you gain more insight into what it's telling you and more choice in how to respond to it. I began practicing this emotional auditing in my daily life. During a tense meeting about project timelines, instead of just registering general stress, I noticed distinct emotions: frustration about unclear expectations, concern about team morale, and a subtle shame about not having anticipated certain obstacles. This more granular awareness changed how I approached the situation. Instead of a generic stress response, I could address the specific emotions and their causes, clarifying expectations, acknowledging team challenges, and being kinder to myself about the unpredictable aspects of the project. Emotions as data, the ruler method. During our next session, Thomas introduced me to a framework from emotional intelligence research called the ruler method. Recognize emotions in yourself and others. Understand the causes and consequences of emotions. Label emotions accurately. Express emotions appropriately. Regulate emotions effectively. This framework treats emotions as valuable data rather than distractions, he explained. It helps us integrate emotional intelligence with critical thinking. I found the understand component particularly valuable. When I felt resistance to a colleague's proposal, rather than dismissing the emotion or being ruled by it, I explored what triggered it. Was I concerned about practical implementation issues? Worried about how it might affect my area of responsibility? Feeling threatened by an approach different from mine? Understanding the triggers and messages behind emotional responses transformed how I contributed to discussions. Instead of saying, "I don't think this will work," a conclusion potentially driven by unexamined emotional reactions, I could offer more specific constructive input. I'm concerned about how this approach might impact customer response times based on what we saw in the last implementation. The emotional rational partnership. Think of your emotional and rational systems as partners, not opponents, Thomas suggested. Each has strengths and limitations, and they work best when they work together. He explained how emotions provide motivation, values, and social connection, while rational processes offer analysis, planning, and logical evaluation. Problems arise when these systems work in isolation or opposition. Pure emotionality without rational analysis can lead to impulsive decisions and confused thinking. But pure rationality without emotional grounding can lead to analysis paralysis or decisions that look good on paper but fail to address what truly matters. This partnership became evident as I worked through the project crisis. My emotional response, the stress and concern I felt, provided important information about what I valued: the team's well-being, our commitment to quality, and meeting customer expectations. My rational analysis helped channel those concerns productively, breaking down the problem, evaluating options systematically, and developing a clear plan. The most effective solutions emerged when I allowed both systems to inform each other. Working with difficult emotions, the RAIN technique. Some emotions are particularly challenging for clear thinking, Thomas acknowledged. Strong anger, fear, or shame can override our more deliberate reasoning processes if we're not skilled at working with them. He introduced a mindfulness-based approach called RAIN for working with difficult emotions. Recognize the emotion. Allow it to be present without judgment. Investigate it with curious attention. Non-identify with it. Recognize that you are experiencing the emotion, not defined by it. I had an opportunity to practice this technique during a heated disagreement with my project sponsor. When he criticized our team's approach in front of others, I felt a surge of anger that threatened to derail my thinking. Instead of immediately reacting, I silently applied the RAIN process. I recognized the anger arising, allowed myself to feel it without immediately acting on it, and investigated it with curiosity. What was beneath the anger? I discovered it wasn't just about the criticism itself, but about feeling unfairly judged without context and concerned about how it might affect team morale. The non-identification step was particularly powerful. By recognizing I'm experiencing anger rather than I am angry, I created space between myself and the emotion. This didn't make the anger disappear, but it allowed me to choose how to respond rather than being driven by the emotion. Instead of reacting defensively, I was able to acknowledge the concern while providing important context. I understand your concern about the timeline delays. Let me share the specific challenges we've encountered and how we're addressing them. Collective emotional intelligence, beyond individual awareness. As our discussions continued, Thomas expanded the focus from individual emotional intelligence to collective emotional dynamics. In teams and organizations, emotions become contagious, he explained. One person's anxiety can spread to others, just as one person's enthusiasm can energize a group. Critical thinking at a collective level requires awareness of these emotional currents. He introduced the concept of emotional contagion and discussed how skilled leaders both monitor and influence the emotional climate of their teams. This awareness transformed how I approach team interactions during our project crisis. I noticed how my own emotional state, when anxious or frustrated, quickly affected others. More importantly, I discovered how deliberately cultivating a balanced emotional stance, acknowledging challenges while maintaining confident determination, positively influenced the team's resilience. During one particularly crucial meeting, I consciously set aside time to acknowledge the stress everyone was feeling, validate the legitimate concerns, and then deliberately shift toward constructive problem solving. The explicit attention to emotional dynamics created space for more creative and collaborative thinking than we'd managed in previous crisis situations. Empathy as a critical thinking tool. One of the most powerful applications of emotional intelligence in critical thinking, Thomas said during our final session on this topic, is empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. He explained how empathy goes beyond simply being nice or supportive. It's a cognitive tool that provides access to perspectives and information we might otherwise miss. When we truly understand how others feel and why, we gain insight into factors we might not have considered from our own limited viewpoint. Empathy expands our thinking by incorporating others' lived experiences into our understanding. I began deliberately practicing empathic inquiry with team members and stakeholders, asking questions designed not just to gather factual information, but to understand their experiences, concerns, and perspectives. This approach revealed crucial insights we'd been missing. A team member who seemed resistant to certain changes shared how similar initiatives at previous companies had negatively impacted customer relationships. A client contact expressed concerns about how our proposed solution would affect their internal processes in ways we hadn't considered. These empathically gained insights didn't just improve relationships. They materially improved our decision-making and problem-solving by incorporating a wider range of relevant factors. Integration, the emotional wisdom path. As winter deepened outside the cafe windows, Thomas summarized our exploration of emotions in critical thinking. The goal isn't perfect emotional control, he emphasized. It's integration, bringing emotional awareness into a productive partnership with analytical thinking. This integration creates what we might call emotional wisdom. He described emotional wisdom as the ability to recognize emotions as they arise, understand their messages and influences, work with them skillfully rather than being controlled by them, access the motivational energy and value information they provide, use empathy to expand perspective and understanding. As I walked through the snowy streets after our session, I reflected on how profoundly this understanding had changed my approach to both work and personal challenges. The artificial divide I'd maintained between rational and emotional thinking was dissolving, replaced by a more integrated approach that honored both dimensions of human experience. Little did I know how crucial this emotional wisdom would prove in navigating the professional and personal crossroads that awaited me in the coming months. Chapter 4. The Art of Questioning. From Answers to Inquiry. Spring had arrived by the time of our next series of meetings, bringing with it a refreshing sense of new possibilities. Thomas suggested we meet in the botanical garden instead of our usual cafe, explaining that the natural setting would complement our next topic perfectly. As we walked along paths lined with early spring blooms, Thomas posed an unexpected question. What do you think is more valuable, having the right answers or asking the right questions? I considered this thoughtfully. My professional training and career advancement had largely centered around demonstrating expertise, providing confident, accurate answers to problems and challenges. But my journey with Thomas had begun to shift this perspective. I used to think answers were more valuable, I admitted. Now I'm beginning to see how powerful the right questions can be. Thomas smiled approvingly. Exactly. Many people believe critical thinking is primarily about analyzing information to arrive at correct answers. But perhaps its greatest power lies in the art of questioning, the ability to ask questions that open new possibilities, challenge assumptions, and deepen understanding. Beyond the surface, the power of deep questioning. Most of us, Thomas continued as we passed a garden of awakening tulips, operate with what I call surface questioning, questions that seek basic information or confirmation of what we already believe. But critical thinking requires deeper questioning that probes beneath the surface. He introduced me to different levels of questioning. Level 1, clarification questions, seeking basic information or facts. What happened? When did it occur? Level 2, analytical questions, exploring relationships, patterns, and causes. How does this relate to that? What factors contributed to this outcome? Level 3, perspective questions, examining different viewpoints and frameworks. How might others see this situation? What alternative approaches exist? Level 4, transformative questions, challenging fundamental assumptions and opening new possibilities. What if our basic premise is wrong? What might we be missing entirely? Most discussions never move beyond level 2, Thomas explained. But the most significant insights often emerge from level 3 and level 4 questions. I reflected on recent team meetings where we've been struggling with declining customer engagement. Our discussions had primarily involved level 1 and 2 questions. What are the engagement metrics? When did the decline begin? How do these trends correlate with recent changes? What might happen, I wondered, if we introduced more level 3 and 4 questions? How might our customers experience our product differently than we imagine? What if engagement isn't actually the right metric for measuring value? What fundamental assumptions about our users might we be missing? The 5 whys, digging to root causes. As we continued our garden walk, Thomas introduced a questioning technique developed by Sakichi Toyoda, founder of Toyota Industries. It's called the 5 whys, he explained, and it's deceptively simple yet remarkably powerful. When faced with a problem, you ask why repeatedly, typically 5 times, to move from symptoms to root causes. He illustrated with an example from manufacturing where a machine was malfunctioning. Why is the machine failing? Because the circuit is overloading. Why is the circuit overloading? Because the bearing is insufficient lubricated. Why is it insufficiently lubricated? Because the lubrication pump isn't working properly. Why isn't the pump working properly? Because its shaft is worn out. Why is the shaft worn out? Because there was no filter to remove metal particles from the lubricant. The solution isn't to replace the circuit or add more lubricant. It's to install a proper filter. Without the 5 whys, we might have addressed symptoms rather than the root cause. I immediately saw applications to challenges we were facing. When a key project had fallen behind schedule, our initial focus had been on adding more resources to speed up development. But using the 5 whys revealed a deeper issue. Why is the project behind schedule? Because tasks are taking longer than estimated. Why are tasks taking longer? Because developers keep encountering unexpected integration issues. Why are there unexpected integration issues? Because the requirements weren't fully defined up front. Why weren't requirements fully defined? Because stakeholders weren't all involved in the planning process. Why weren't all stakeholders involved? Because our project initiation process doesn't include a comprehensive stakeholder mapping step. This analysis shifted our solution from simply adding more developers, which might have actually made coordination problems worse, to improving our project initiation process to ensure all stakeholders contributed to requirements definition. Socratic questioning, the art of guided inquiry. One of the most powerful questioning approaches, Thomas said as we paused by a reflecting pool, comes from Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher. Socratic questioning uses thoughtful inquiry to help people examine their own thinking and discover insights for themselves. He explained the 6 types of Socratic questions. Clarification questions. What exactly do you mean by that? Could you give an example? Assumption probing questions. What are you assuming here? Why do you think this assumption holds true? Evidence questions. What evidence supports this view? How might we test this idea? Viewpoint questions. How might someone else see this issue? What would be an alternative perspective? Implication questions. What would be the consequences of this approach? Where might this lead? Reflective questions. Why do you think this question matters? What have we learned from exploring this issue? The power of Socratic questioning, Thomas emphasized, is that it doesn't impose ideas but helps people discover insights through their own reasoning process. I began experimenting with this approach in team discussions, shifting from making declarative statements to asking thoughtful questions. When a colleague proposed a solution I thought was problematic, rather than stating my objections, I asked, "What assumptions are we making about user behavior with this approach? And what might be the unintended consequences if those assumptions aren't correct?" The difference was remarkable. Instead of becoming defensive, my colleague engaged thoughtfully with these questions. Together, we explored assumptions neither of us had fully examined, ultimately developing a more robust solution than either of us had initially envisioned. Question frames. How structure shapes possibility. As we walked through a section of the garden designed with careful geometric precision, Thomas introduced the concept of question framing. The way we frame a question powerfully shapes the range of possible answers, he explained. Different frames open different pathways for exploration and discovery. He illustrated with variations on essentially the same inquiry. Why has this project failed? Assumes failure and focuses on blame. What challenges has this project encountered? Acknowledges difficulties without assuming complete failure. What can we learn from his project's outcomes? Focuses on learning and improvement regardless of outcome. How might we approach similar initiatives differently in the future? Future-oriented and solution-focused. Notice how each framing creates a different emotional response and guides thinking in different directions, Thomas observed. The art of questioning includes choosing frames that open productive pathways rather than closing them. This insight proved immediately valuable. We had a product feature that had received mixed user feedback, and the team was becoming demoralized. In our review meeting, rather than asking, "Why didn't users engage with this feature as expected?" a negative, backward-looking frame, I asked, "What have we learned about user preferences from this feature's performance, and how might we apply those insights to future development?" The reframed question transformed the conversation from one of disappointment and defensiveness to one of curiosity and forward-looking creativity. Appreciative inquiry. The power of positive questioning. Most problem-solving approaches, Thomas noted as we entered a vibrant garden filled with colorful blooms, start by focusing on deficits, gaps, and what's wrong. But there's another approach called appreciative inquiry that begins by examining what's working well and how to build upon it. He explained the 4 phases of appreciative inquiry. Discover. When has this worked exceptionally well, even briefly? Dream. What might be possible if we built on these strengths? Design. How might we create more of these positive conditions? Destiny. How can we implement and sustain these changes? This doesn't mean ignoring problems, Thomas clarified. It means approaching them from a different angle, looking for existing strengths that can be leveraged rather than just focusing on what's broken. I applied this approach with a team that was struggling with cross-department collaboration. Instead of asking, "Why is collaboration failing?" we explored, when have we collaborated effectively, even if just for a short period? What conditions enabled that success? This inquiry revealed specific practices from a previous project that had facilitated excellent collaboration but hadn't been carried forward. By identifying and systematizing these practices, we were able to significantly improve cross-team dynamics without having to start from scratch or focus excessively on failings. Creating a questioning culture beyond individual technique. As our garden walk neared its conclusion, Thomas expanded our discussion from individual questioning practices to organizational cultures. The most innovative organizations, he observed, create cultures where questioning is valued as highly as answering. They recognize that good questions drive discovery and improvement, while an overemphasis on having all the answers can stifle growth. He described characteristics of organizations with strong questioning cultures. Leaders who openly acknowledge uncertainty and model thoughtful inquiry. Meetings that allocate time for questions, not just presentations. recognition, and rewards for questions that lead to important insights. Question thinking time built into project planning and evaluation. Safe spaces for challenging fundamental assumptions without fear. I realized how different this was from many of my professional experiences, where demonstrating certainty and expertise through definitive answers was the primary currency of credibility. Yet the most significant breakthroughs I'd witnessed had indeed come from someone asking an unexpected question that challenged prevailing assumptions. The personal practice of questioning. Before we parted, Thomas suggested establishing a personal questioning practice to develop this aspect of critical thinking. Set aside time each day to ask yourself reflective questions, he advised. Keep a questioning journal where you record particularly powerful questions and the insights they generate. And try adopting a question of the week that you explore from different angles over several days. He also recommended deliberate practice in conversations. Try to notice when you're about to make a declarative statement and see if you can transform it into a thoughtful question instead. Not as a verbal trick, but as a genuine invitation to deeper thinking. As spring sunshine filtered through newly leafed trees, I reflected on how this exploration of questioning had shifted my understanding of critical thinking. Rather than seeing it primarily as a tool for finding correct answers, I was beginning to appreciate its power for opening new possibilities, challenging hidden assumptions, and fostering collaborative discovery. Questions, Thomas had said as we concluded our walk, are the seed from which new understanding grows. Looking at the awakening garden around us, this metaphor felt particularly apt. A reminder that the richest thinking, like the most beautiful gardens, begins not with final forms, but with the humble act of planting seeds of inquiry. Chapter 5. Breaking Through Mental Barriers, the Power of Perspective. The summer heat had settled over the city by the time of our next series of meetings. Thomas suggested we meet at a contemporary art museum, explaining that the experience would provide perfect context for our next exploration. As we walked through an exhibition featuring optical illusions and perspective-challenging installations, Thomas posed a question. What do you see here? He gestured toward a painting that, from our angle, appeared to be a chaotic arrangement of shapes and colors. I described what I saw, an abstract composition with no discernible subject. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, then guided me to move several steps to the right. Suddenly, the seemingly random elements resolved into a perfectly clear image of a human face. This, he said with a smile, is a perfect metaphor for one of the most powerful aspects of critical thinking, the ability to shift perspective. What appears incomprehensible from one viewpoint becomes clear from another. The painting didn't change, your perspective did. Mental barriers, the invisible walls of thought. Most of the limitations in our thinking, Thomas continued as we moved through the gallery, aren't external but internal, mental barriers we've constructed over time, often without realizing it. He introduced some common types of mental barriers. 1. Fixation, getting stuck in one way of thinking about a problem. 2. Functional fixedness, seeing objects or ideas only in their traditional roles. 3. Self-imposed constraints, adding unnecessary limitations to problems. 4. Black and white thinking, seeing only extreme options rather than a spectrum of possibilities. 5. Expert blindness, being unable to see beyond established expertise and practices. These barriers serve as mental shortcuts that help us navigate familiar situations efficiently, Thomas explained. But when we face novel problems or need innovative solutions, these same shortcuts can become obstacles. I recognized several of these barriers in my own thinking. When our team had encountered unexpected integration challenges in a recent project, I had immediately framed it as a technical problem requiring a technical solution, fixation. It wasn't until a junior team member asked if we could change our approach entirely that we discovered a much simpler solution involving a process change rather than a technical fix. Perspective shifting, tools for breaking through barriers. As we stopped before an installation that created different images depending on where you stood, Thomas introduced techniques for deliberately shifting perspective. Conscious perspective shifting is like mental yoga, he suggested. It stretches your thinking in new directions, creating flexibility that allows you to see beyond your current viewpoint. He described several practical techniques. 1. Role reversal. How would this look from another person's position? Imagining yourself in someone else's role, a colleague, customer, competitor, or even a historical figure, to gain fresh insights. 2. Time shifting. How would this look from a different time perspective? Considering a current situation from the viewpoint of the past. How did we get here? Or the future. How will this look a year from now? 3. Scale changing. What would change if we zoomed in or out? Examining a situation at different scales, from granular details to big picture patterns. 4. Constraint adding/removing. What if we added or removed key constraints? Artificially imposing new limitations or removing assumed ones to stimulate creative thinking. 5. Analogical thinking. What does this remind me of in a different domain? Finding parallels between the current situation and seemingly unrelated areas to generate new insights. I began experimenting with these techniques in my daily work. When we faced a complex product design decision, I facilitated a perspective-shifting exercise where team members adopted different stakeholder viewpoints: developer, end user, customer support, sales. The insights generated by this simple shift highlighted important considerations we had overlooked from our product management perspective. Mental models, expanding your cognitive toolkit. Another powerful way to break through mental barriers, Thomas explained as we entered a new gallery, is to deliberately expand your collection of mental models, the conceptual frameworks you use to make sense of the world. He described how different disciplines, from biology to economics, physics to psychology, offer unique mental models that can be applied across domains. When you approach a problem with only one mental model, it's like having a single tool in your toolkit. But when you can draw upon multiple models from different fields, your ability to understand complex situations expands dramatically. Thomas introduced several powerful mental models. 1. Inversion, thinking backward from the goal or considering the opposite of what you want. 2. Second-order thinking, considering not just immediate effects, but consequences of those effects. 3. Opportunity costs, recognizing that every choice means foregoing alternative options. 4. Probabilistic thinking, considering ranges of likelihood rather than certainties. 5. Systems thinking, understanding how parts interact within larger wholes. I was particularly struck by inversion thinking. When struggling with how to improve customer satisfaction, instead of directly asking, how can we make customers happier? We tried the inverted question. What are all the ways we might frustrate or disappoint our customers? This simple flip generated remarkably insightful discussion about irritating aspects of our product that we had become blind to through familiarity. Perspective reflection, examining your own viewpoint. As we paused for refreshments in the museum cafe, Thomas shifted our focus inward. Perhaps the most powerful perspective shift, he suggested, is the ability to examine your own viewpoint as if it were someone else's. This meta-perspective allows you to recognize the limitations and biases in your own thinking. He introduced a reflective practice he called viewpoint inventory. Identify your position on an issue or problem. Articulate the key assumptions underlying this position. Consider the influences that shaped this viewpoint: education, experiences, values. Examine emotional attachments to this perspective. Imagine how others might critique your position. The goal isn't to abandon your perspective, Thomas clarified, but to hold it more consciously, understanding its foundations, limitations, and the alternatives that exist. I applied this practice to a strategic recommendation I was preparing about expanding into a new market segment. By examining my own viewpoint through this structured reflection, I realized I had an emotional attachment to the expansion idea, partly because it aligned with my professional interests. This awareness didn't invalidate the recommendation, but it helped me ensure I was considering evidence both for and against it more objectively. Collaborative perspective taking, multiplying insights. While individual perspective shifting is powerful, Thomas noted as we continued our museum tour, The potential expands dramatically when we engage in deliberate perspective-taking with others. He described techniques for collaborative perspective exploration. 1. Perspective rotation. Having team members temporarily adopt different viewpoints and advocate from those positions. 2. Red team/blue team exercises. Dividing into groups that argue opposing sides of an issue, regardless of personal views. 3. Pre-mortem analysis. Imagining a project has failed and working backwards to identify potential causes. 4. Stakeholder mapping. Systematically identifying all parties affected by a decision and considering their differing perspectives. These approaches resonated with challenges I'd been facing in building consensus around a major organizational change. Rather than trying to convince skeptical colleagues through direct persuasion, I organized a perspective rotation exercise where those supporting and opposing the change had to argue from the opposite viewpoint. The results were remarkable. Not only did it create better mutual understanding, but it also revealed legitimate concerns and opportunities that neither side had previously recognized. The exercise transformed a polarized debate into a more nuanced, collaborative exploration. Beyond cognitive barriers, emotional and social dimensions. As we approached a particularly provocative installation, one that deliberately triggered uncomfortable emotional responses, Thomas broadened our discussion. Mental barriers aren't purely cognitive, he observed. They're often intertwined with emotional and social dimensions that can be even more limiting. He described how fear of being wrong, concern about social approval, attachment to past successes, and institutional pressures all create barriers to flexible thinking that go beyond simple cognitive limitations. Complete perspective flexibility requires not just intellectual techniques, but emotional resilience and social courage. The willingness to withstand discomfort, uncertainty, and sometimes disapproval as you explore beyond conventional viewpoints. This insight struck a deep chord. I recalled situations where I intellectually recognized alternative perspectives, but emotionally remained attached to my initial view, especially when it was shared by respected colleagues. The social pull to maintain consensus had sometimes been stronger than the cognitive pull toward better understanding. Integration, the meta-perspective. Our museum visit concluded with an immersive installation that surrounded visitors with shifting images and sounds, creating an experience that couldn't be fully comprehended from any single viewpoint. This, Thomas said, gesturing to the dynamic environment around us, represents the ultimate goal of perspective development in critical thinking, what we might call the meta-perspective. Not just the ability to shift between viewpoints, but to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, recognizing the partial truth in each. He explained that the most complex challenges we face, whether in business, relationships, or society, rarely have single correct perspectives. Understanding them requires the capacity to integrate multiple, sometimes contradictory viewpoints into a more comprehensive whole. It's not about finding the one right perspective, but about developing perspective flexibility, the ability to move fluidly between viewpoints, seeing both the limitations and contributions of each. As we left the museum and stepped into the bright summer afternoon, I reflected on how this exploration had deepened my understanding of critical thinking. Beyond analyzing information or questioning assumptions, it involved a fundamental flexibility of mind, the capacity to see beyond current viewpoints into new possibilities. The bustling city street, with its diverse individuals each carrying their own unique perspective on the shared reality around them, seemed like a living illustration of the principles we discussed. Each viewpoint partial yet valid, contributing to a collective understanding richer than any individual could achieve alone. The art of critical thinking, Thomas had said as we parted, isn't about finding the one perfect vantage point. It's about developing the agility to dance between perspectives, gathering insights from each, while maintaining the humility to recognize that your own view is inevitably incomplete. This understanding would prove invaluable in navigating the complex leadership challenge that awaited me in the coming weeks, one that would test my perspective flexibility in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Chapter 6. The integration of logic and intuition. The leaves were beginning to turn when Thomas and I met again, this time at a chess park where elderly masters and young enthusiasts gathered to play. We found an empty table and Thomas set up a board, explaining that our game would serve as both recreation and illustration for our next topic. Most people, he began, making his opening move, think of critical thinking as purely logical, a step-by-step analytical process. But the most powerful thinking integrates logic with intuition, bringing together the sequential reasoning of the left brain with the pattern recognition of the right. I moved my pawn, considering his words. Throughout my career, I'd often been told to trust the data and avoid gut decisions. Intuition was frequently portrayed as the enemy of sound analysis rather than its partner. Watch how the chess masters play, Thomas suggested, gesturing to a nearby game where a white-haired man was competing with a young woman. They certainly use logical analysis, calculating potential moves and consequences. But they also rely heavily on intuitive pattern recognition, a sense of the board that comes from experience and can't always be articulated step by step. The false dichotomy, logic versus intuition. As our chess game progressed, Thomas elaborated on what he called the false dichotomy between logical and intuitive thinking. Western intellectual tradition has created an artificial separation between these two aspects of cognition, he explained, contemplating his next move. We've elevated logical, analytical thinking as rational while dismissing intuitive insights as irrational or merely emotional. But this dichotomy doesn't reflect how our minds actually work at their best. He described research from cognitive science showing that what we experience as intuition is often pattern recognition operating below the level of conscious awareness, drawing on vast stores of experience and knowledge that we process too quickly to articulate step by step. Expert intuition isn't magic, Thomas clarified. It's the mind processing information in ways that outpace our conscious awareness. The chess master who just knows the right move is drawing on thousands of patterns from previous games, recognized so quickly it feels like intuition rather than analysis. This perspective resonated with experiences I'd had but never fully trusted. Moments when I sensed a problem with a project direction before I could logically explain why, or when I felt a solution approach was promising before I could articulate all the reasons. I'd often downplayed these intuitive signals, waiting until I could construct a fully logical case before acting on them. Intuition, types, and reliability. Not all intuition is equally reliable, Thomas cautioned as he captured one of my pieces. We need to distinguish between different types of intuitive judgment. He outlined 3 major categories. 1. Expert intuition, rapid pattern recognition based on extensive domain-specific experience. Highly reliable in stable environments where clear feedback has allowed learning. 2. Heuristic intuition, mental shortcuts or rules of thumb that help navigate common situations. Useful but prone to systematic biases and errors in novel contexts. 3. Creative intuition, connections and insights that emerge from the unconscious mind, often when the conscious mind is relaxed or engaged elsewhere. Valuable for innovation, but needs critical evaluation. The key, Thomas emphasized, is knowing which type of intuition you're experiencing and calibrating your trust accordingly. He explained how expert intuition tends to be most reliable in domains where you have substantial, relevant experience. The environment has reasonable stability and regularity. You've received clear, timely feedback on past judgments. Pattern recognition is central to performance. A firefighter's intuition about building collapse dangers deserves high trust. A first-time investor's gut feel about market movements deserves more skepticism. The difference isn't intuition versus logic. It's well-calibrated versus poorly calibrated intuition. I realized I had been treating all intuitive judgments with the same level of skepticism, regardless of my expertise in the area. In software architecture, where I had deep experience, my intuitive concerns about implementation approaches often prove correct. In marketing decisions, where my experience was limited, my intuitive judgments were much less reliable. Integrating systems, the dual process model. As our chess game continued, Thomas introduced the dual process model of thinking from cognitive psychology. Researchers often described two complementary systems in the mind, he explained. System 1 is fast, automatic, pattern-based, and often unconscious, what we might call intuitive thinking. System 2 is slower, deliberate, analytical, and conscious, what we typically call logical thinking. He emphasized that both systems have strengths and limitations. System 1, intuitive, fast and effortless, processes vast amounts of information simultaneously, excels at pattern recognition, can detect subtle emotional and social cues, vulnerable to biases, and can jump to conclusions. System 2, analytical, methodical and thorough, can follow explicit rules and procedures, able to consider hypotheticals and counterfactuals, less vulnerable to certain biases, slower and requires more mental energy. True critical thinking, Thomas suggested, making a strategic move on the board, involves knowing when and how to engage each system and how to create productive dialogue between them. Practical integration, tools, and techniques. How do we actually integrate these systems in practice? I asked, contemplating my increasingly precarious position on the chessboard. Thomas offered several practical approaches. 1. The intuition analysis cycle. Begin by allowing intuitive impressions to emerge, then subject them to analytical scrutiny. Use the analytical process to test and refine intuitive judgments. Then let that analysis inform future intuitive responses. He described how expert decision-makers often follow this pattern. Notice an intuitive reaction or judgment. Analyze to understand its basis and test its validity. Act based on the integration of intuitive and analytical insights. Reflect on outcomes to refine future intuitive judgments. 2. Deliberate incubation. When facing complex problems, allow time for unconscious processing. Engage with the problem analytically, then step away and let your unconscious mind work on it while you do something else. Thomas explained how many creative breakthroughs and problem solutions emerge during periods of relaxation after intense focus, while walking, showering, or engaging in unrelated activities. This incubation effect allows intuitive pattern matching to continue below conscious awareness. 3. Externalize and visualize. Get your thinking out of your head and into external form where both systems can engage with it. Create mind maps, diagrams, or models that make patterns visible and accessible to both intuitive recognition and logical analysis. We discussed how visual thinking tools create bridges between intuitive pattern recognition and analytical reasoning, allowing both systems to contribute to understanding complex situations. Calibrating intuition, feedback, and reflection. Perhaps the most important practice, Thomas said as he placed me in check, is deliberate intuition calibration through structured feedback and reflection. He described how expert intuition develops not just from experience, but from experience with clear feedback that allows learning. Without such feedback, even extensive experience may not develop reliable intuition. Thomas suggested methods for strengthening this feedback loop. Keep a decision journal recording intuitive judgments and their outcomes. Establish clear, measurable criteria for evaluating decisions before seeing results. Schedule regular reviews comparing intuitive judgments against actual outcomes. Seek feedback from diverse perspectives to offset individual biases. Over time, he explained, this deliberate practice creates stronger connection between your intuitive and analytical systems, as unconscious pattern recognition becomes increasingly aligned with valid analytical frameworks. I began applying this approach immediately, creating a simple log of project decisions where I recorded both my analytical reasoning and intuitive reactions. Reviewing these entries weeks later revealed patterns in both the strengths and limitations of my intuitive judgments, areas where my gut feelings deserved more trust and others where they needed more scrutiny. Organizational integration, beyond individual thinking. As our chess game concluded with my inevitable defeat, Thomas expanded our discussion to organizational contexts. Organizations as a whole can suffer from the same false dichotomy, valuing data and analysis while dismissing experiential knowledge and intuitive judgment. The most effective organizations integrate both forms of knowing. He described characteristics of organizations that successfully integrate intuitive and analytical thinking, creating diverse teams that combine analytical and intuitive strengths, establishing decision processes that explicitly incorporate both forms of input, valuing experiential knowledge alongside quantitative data, developing feedback systems that help calibrate collective intuition, building reflective practices that strengthen the connections between analysis and intuition. In my own organization, I recognized our tendency to prioritize data-driven arguments while undervaluing the experiential wisdom of frontline team members. When planning a significant product update, I deliberately changed our process to incorporate structured sessions where experienced customer-facing staff could share intuitive concerns and pattern-based insights before we finalized the analytical business case. The resulting plan was stronger for integrating both perspectives, capturing quantifiable market opportunities identified through analysis while addressing subtle user experience concerns that emerge from the intuitive pattern recognition of our most experienced team members. The ethics of integration. Before we parted, Thomas raised an important ethical dimension of this integration. Because intuitive judgments operate partly below conscious awareness, they can be particularly vulnerable to implicit biases, he cautioned. Without analytical scrutiny, intuition can perpetuate discrimination and unfairness without our realizing it. He emphasized that true integration of logic and intuition includes ethical vigilance, using analytical processes to examine intuitive judgments for potential bias, while also using intuitive moral sensitivity to recognize when seemingly logical analyses might lead to harmful outcomes. The most powerful critical thinking, Thomas concluded as we packed up the chess pieces, comes when we stop seeing logic and intuition as opponents and recognize them as essential partners. Logic without intuition becomes rigid and blind to patterns it hasn't been programmed to see. Intuition without logic becomes undisciplined and vulnerable to bias. Together, they create a more complete intelligence than either could achieve alone. As autumn leaves drifted around us in the park, I reflected on how this understanding might transform both my individual decision-making and our collective approaches to complex challenges. The integration of these complementary ways of knowing seemed to offer a path toward both sharper analysis and deeper wisdom, a synthesis I was eager to explore in the complex project awaiting me back at the office. Checkmate isn't just about logic or just about intuition, Thomas had observed as he captured my king. It's about the seamless integration of both, seeing patterns while calculating consequences, feeling the flow of the game while analyzing specific moves. That integration is what we're really seeking in critical thinking. Chapter 7. From Insight to Action. Implementing Critical Thinking. The winter chill had settled over the city when Thomas and I met for our next conversation. We chose a small, warm cafe with a view of the harbor, where fishing boats and cargo ships navigated the gray waters. Knowledge without application has limited value, Thomas began, watching a boat skillfully maneuver against choppy waters. We've explored many aspects of critical thinking, but today I want to focus on implementation, how to translate improved thinking into effective action. This topic felt particularly relevant. Over the months of our conversations, I developed new insights and approaches, but I still sometimes struggled to apply them consistently, especially under pressure or in emotionally charged situations. The knowing-doing gap, understanding the barriers. Most of us have experienced what researchers call the knowing-doing gap, Thomas explained. We know what we should do, the better approach, the wiser decision, but we don't actually do it. Understanding this gap is the first step to bridging it. He outlined common barriers that prevent people from implementing their critical thinking insights. 1. Cognitive overload. When we're overwhelmed with information or demands, we tend to default to habitual thinking patterns rather than applying new approaches, even when we know better. 2. Emotional interference. Strong emotions, fear, anger, anxiety, can override our best thinking, triggering reactive responses rather than thoughtful action. 3. Social pressure. The desire to conform to group expectations or avoid conflict can lead us to suppress insights that challenge prevailing views. 4. Implementation complexity. Sometimes we see the better path but struggle with the practical steps needed to follow it, especially when it requires changing established systems or routines. 5. Perfectionism paralysis. Waiting for perfect clarity or complete certainty before acting can prevent implementation of even well-reasoned insights. I recognized several of these barriers from recent experiences. During a particularly stressful project review, I'd reverted to defensive reactions despite knowing better approaches. In another situation, I'd held back important critical perspectives in a meeting dominated by strong personalities, even though I recognized flaws in the direction being taken. Building implementation bridges. The good news, Thomas continued, is that we can build deliberate bridges across this knowing-doing gap. Implementation of critical thinking isn't just about having better insights. It's about creating systems and practices that help translate those insights into consistent action. He introduced several practical approaches. 1. Environmental design. Structure your environment to support better thinking and decision-making. Remove distractions. Create visual reminders of key principles, and design spaces that encourage reflection rather than reaction. I began applying this immediately, creating a small thinking checklist that I kept visible during important meetings and decision points. The simple visual cue helped me remember key questions and approaches we discussed when I might otherwise have defaulted to habitual patterns. 2. Implementation intentions. Research shows that forming specific, thin plans dramatically increases follow-through on intentions. Instead of general commitments, to think more critically, create specific triggers and responses. Thomas suggested creating implementation intentions like, if I notice myself becoming defensive in a discussion, then I will pause and ask a genuine question about the other perspective. If a decision feels rushed, then I will explicitly request time for thoughtful consideration. If I notice team consensus forming too quickly, then I will ensure contrary perspectives are fully explored. These specific plans helped bridge the gap between my intentions and actions, especially in challenging situations where I might otherwise revert to old patterns. 3. Deliberate practice. Like any complex skill, implementing critical thinking requires practice, not just in easy circumstances, but especially in challenging ones. Create opportunities to practice in progressively more difficult situations. I began seeking out low-stakes opportunities to practice new approaches, volunteering to facilitate discussions on moderately controversial topics, deliberately engaging with people who held different perspectives, and explicitly practicing new questioning techniques in routine meetings before applying them in higher-stakes contexts. 4. Feedback systems. Establish regular reviews and reflection processes to evaluate how effectively you're implementing your critical thinking insights. Without structured feedback, it's easy to overestimate consistency or miss patterns. Following Thomas's advice, I created a simple weekly review practice, asking myself questions like, where did I successfully apply the critical thinking approaches we've discussed? Where did I revert to old patterns despite knowing better? What specific barriers prevented implementation? What adjustments will help me bridge the gap next time? This regular reflection accelerated my learning and helped identify specific implementation challenges to address. From individual to collective implementation. While individual implementation is important, Thomas observed, watching a crew working together to dock a fishing boat, many of our most significant opportunities involve collective implementation, helping teams and organizations apply critical thinking principles consistently. He outlined approaches for extending implementation beyond individual practice. 1. process design build critical thinking principles directly into organizational processes, decision protocols, meeting structures, project reviews, rather than relying on individuals to apply them consistently on their own. I experimented with this approach when redesigning our project planning process, incorporating specific steps for perspective taking, assumption testing, and alternative generation that previously depended on individual initiative. By embedding these elements in the standard process, critical thinking became the default rather than the exception. 2. Cultural signals. Look for opportunities to recognize and reward critical thinking implementation, creating cultural signals that reinforce its value. Celebrate instances where challenging assumptions led to better outcomes, not just instances of being right. This insight led me to change how I recognize team contributions, highlighting cases where team members demonstrated intellectual humility, perspective taking, or effective questioning rather than focusing exclusively on who provided the ultimately successful solution. 3. Facilitation roles designate specific roles in key meetings or decisions to ensure critical thinking elements are implemented. For example, appointing different people to serve as assumption testers, alternative generators, or perspective advocates. We implemented this approach during strategic planning sessions, assigning specific team members to represent different stakeholder perspectives and question core assumptions, regardless of their personal views. This role-based approach helped ensure important critical thinking elements weren't overlooked in the press of business. 4. Environmental affordances create physical and digital environments that support implementation. Visual reminders, spaces designed for reflection, tools that prompt deeper thinking. Following this principle, we redesigned our project rooms to include dedicated wall space for capturing assumptions, alternatives, and diverse perspectives. These visual affordances made critical thinking elements more visible and accessible during ongoing work. Handling implementation challenges. Implementation isn't always smooth, Thomas cautioned as we watched a boat struggle against a strong crosswind. You'll encounter resistance, both internal and external. Preparing for these challenges increases your ability to navigate them effectively. He outlined common implementation challenges and strategies for addressing them. 1. Resistance to pace. Critical thinking often requires slowing down, which can feel uncomfortable in fast-paced environments. Emphasize that thoughtful consideration typically saves time in the long run by preventing costly errors and rework. This challenge emerged when implementing more thorough assumption testing in our development process. Some team members worried it would slow progress, but we were able to demonstrate how previous projects had lost more time fixing issues that could have been identified earlier through better critical thinking. 2. Push back against questioning. In some environments, questioning assumptions or exploring alternatives can be perceived as opposition or a lack of commitment. Frame critical thinking as strengthening ideas rather than attacking them. I encountered this challenge when introducing more rigorous questioning practices in our executive review meetings. By explicitly positioning these practices as ways to pressure test ideas to make them stronger rather than finding flaws, we were able to reduce defensiveness and increase acceptance. 3. Impatience with process. Thorough critical thinking sometimes requires process steps that can feel unnecessary to those who haven't experienced their value. Start with simple demonstrations that show clear benefits before implementing more fully. Rather than immediately implementing a comprehensive critical thinking framework across all projects, we began with a single high-visibility initiative where we applied the full approach. The superior outcomes provided compelling evidence that helped overcome resistance when we expanded to other areas. 4. Reversion under pressure. Under stress or time pressure, both individuals and groups tend to revert to habitual patterns. Create simple crisis protocols that preserve essential critical thinking elements, even in high-pressure situations. We developed what we called rapid critical thinking protocols, streamlined versions of our more comprehensive approaches that could be applied even under severe time constraints. These preserved core elements like explicitly stating assumptions, and considering key alternative perspectives without requiring the full process. Sustaining implementation, from effort to habit. The ultimate goal, Thomas explained as our conversation continued, is to move from effortful implementation to habitual practice, where critical thinking approaches become your default rather than requiring conscious application. He described the typical progression from novice to expert implementation. Conscious application, deliberately applying specific techniques with significant effort. Increasing fluency, more comfortable application requiring less conscious thought. Contextual adaptation, flexibly modifying approaches based on situation. Integrated practice, critical thinking elements becoming seamlessly incorporated into natural thinking patterns. This progression takes time, Thomas emphasized. Don't become discouraged if implementation still requires conscious effort. With consistent practice, these approaches gradually become more automatic. He suggested several approaches for accelerating this progression. 1. Regular reflection. Schedule consistent review of your implementation efforts, identifying both successes and challenges. This deliberate reflection speeds the development of intuitive mastery. 2. Graduated challenges. Systematically expose yourself to progressively more difficult implementation contexts, building capability through incremental challenges rather than overwhelming yourself. 3. Implementation communities. Connect with others practicing similar approaches, creating mutual support and accountability that sustains effort through difficult periods. 4. Environmental consistency. Where possible, create consistent environmental cues and supports that trigger appropriate thinking patterns until they become habitual. From tools to identity, the deepest implementation. As our meeting drew to a close, Thomas shared what he considered the most profound aspect of implementation. The deepest level of implementation, he suggested, comes when critical thinking shifts from something you do to a fundamental aspect of who you are, when it becomes part of your identity rather than just a set of tools you apply. He described how this identity-level implementation manifests. You naturally question assumptions rather than having to remind yourself. Seeking diverse perspectives becomes an instinctive response rather than a technique. Testing your own thinking becomes as automatic as breathing. Your curiosity about alternative viewpoints becomes genuine rather than forced. This transition from technique to identity doesn't happen overnight, Thomas acknowledged. It emerges gradually through consistent practice, reflection, and the accumulation of experiences that demonstrate the value of these approaches. As we prepared to leave the cafe, watching boats navigate the harbor through winter mist, Thomas offered a final observation. Implementation is ultimately about integration, weaving critical thinking so deeply into your approach to life and work that you no longer experience it as separate from your natural thinking. Like those sailors who sense the wind and adjust their course without conscious calculation, your critical thinking eventually becomes not what you do, but simply how you navigate the world. The metaphor resonated deeply as I watched the skilled movements of the harbor pilots. What had once required their conscious attention and explicit technique had clearly become integrated into their identity as sailors, a natural extension of who they were rather than a separate set of skills they applied. I realized this was the journey I had begun, not just acquiring critical thinking techniques, but gradually integrating them into my fundamental approach to life's challenges and opportunities. The implementation barriers we discussed were real, but with consistent practice and the approaches Thomas had shared, I could see a path toward that deeper integration where critical thinking would become not just what I did, but who I was. Chapter 8. Critical Thinking in Relationships. The Interpersonal Dimension. Spring had returned by the time of our next meeting. Thomas suggested we meet at a community garden where volunteers of all ages work together, tending shared plots. As we walked among the flourishing beds of vegetables and flowers, he introduced our next topic. We've explored many dimensions of critical thinking as an individual cognitive skill, he observed, but today I want to focus on its interpersonal dimension, how critical thinking functions in relationships, conversations, and collaborative contexts. This topic particularly interested me. While I had made progress applying critical thinking approaches in my individual work, I still struggled sometimes to maintain them in interpersonal situations, especially those involving conflict, disagreement, or strong emotions. The relationship paradox in critical thinking. There's a fascinating paradox in how critical thinking operates in relationships. Thomas began, pausing to observe two gardeners discussing how to address a plant disease. On one hand, other people can be our greatest resources for better thinking, offering different perspectives, challenging our assumptions, and helping us see our blind spots. On the other hand, social dynamics often create the very conditions that make critical thinking most difficult. He explained how relationships introduce complex factors that can either enhance or hinder critical thinking. Enhancing factors: access to diverse perspectives and experiences, external validation or questioning of our reasoning, collective intelligence that exceeds individual capability, emotional support that helps manage the discomfort of uncertainty. Hindering factors: desire for social harmony and conflict avoidance, conformity pressure and groupthink, status dynamics that privilege certain voices, emotional reactions that trigger defensive reasoning. The art of critical thinking in relationships, Thomas suggested, involves creating conditions that maximize the enhancing factors while minimizing the hindering ones. Creating psychological safety, the foundation. The most fundamental requirement for critical thinking in relationships, Thomas continued as we found a bench near a community herb garden, is psychological safety, the shared belief that the relationship is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. He explained how psychologically safe relationships allow people to express doubts, ask questions, challenge assumptions, and admit uncertainties without fear of punishment, rejection, or diminished standing. Without this foundation, he noted, many critical thinking practices become threatening rather than helpful. People withhold concerns, conform to expected views, and defend positions rather than exploring alternatives. Thomas described key practices for building psychological safety. 1. Modeling intellectual humility, demonstrating comfort with uncertainty, willingness to be wrong, and openness to different perspectives. 2. Separating ideas from identity, creating clear distinction between questioning a perspective and questioning a person's value. 3. Explicit permission structures, establishing clear norms that specifically encourage questioning, doubt, and constructive disagreement. 4. Responding productively to challenges, demonstrating appreciation rather than defensiveness when others raise questions or alternative viewpoints. I recognized several opportunities to apply these principles in my team interactions. Despite espousing openness to different perspectives, I realized I sometimes responded to challenges with subtle defensive signals, tense body language, brief responses, or quickly shifting topics. These reactions likely undermined the psychological safety needed for others to fully engage in critical thinking. The dialogue approach, beyond debate and discussion. Once psychological safety is established, Thomas explained, the next question becomes how to structure conversation in ways that support critical thinking. This is where dialogue becomes essential. He outlined 3 common modes of conversation, each with different relationships to critical thinking. Debate. Purpose: determining which position is superior. Dynamic. Oppositional and competitive. Thinking mode: advocacy and critique. Relationship to critical thinking. Can identify flaws in reasoning, but often creates defensive responses that limit genuine exploration. Discussion. Purpose: analyzing issues and making decisions. Dynamic. Exchanging viewpoints with limited integration. Thinking mode: analytical comparison of options. Relationship to critical thinking. Allows examination of alternatives, but often remains at surface level without deep questioning of assumptions. Dialogue. Purpose: creating shared understanding and new insights. Dynamic. Collaborative exploration and building. Thinking mode: inquiry and integration. Relationship to critical thinking. Creates conditions for examining assumptions, integrating diverse perspectives, and developing emergent understanding. Dialogue doesn't replace debate or discussion. Thomas clarified. Each has its place, but dialogue creates uniquely favorable conditions for collective critical thinking because it focuses on inquiry rather than advocacy and integration rather than competition. He suggested practical approaches for shifting conversations toward dialogue. 1. Inquiry-based questions, asking genuine questions aimed at understanding rather than challenging or leading. I'm curious about how you see this issue. Rather than, don't you think that approach would fail because? 2. Explicit assumption exploration, inviting collaborative examination of the assumptions underlying different perspectives. What assumptions are we each making about user behavior in these different approaches? 3. Building rather than competing, actively looking for ways to connect and build upon others' contributions rather than positioning ideas in opposition. Building on your point about user experience, I wonder if we might also consider 4. Slowing the conversational pace, creating space for reflection, deeper consideration, and emergence of new insights rather than rapid exchanges. Let's take a moment to reflect on what we've heard so far before proceeding. These approaches resonated with challenges I'd been experiencing in our product strategy meetings, where conversations often devolved into competing advocacy rather than collaborative exploration. I resolved to introduce more dialogue-based approaches in our upcoming strategic planning sessions. Navigating disagreement beyond right and wrong. One of the most challenging aspects of critical thinking in relationships, Thomas observed as we watched two gardeners respectfully disagreeing about a planting approach, is how to handle substantial differences of perspective, especially on issues that matter deeply. He explained how our conventional approaches to disagreement often undermine rather than enhance critical thinking. We typically frame disagreement as a matter of who's right and who's wrong, a framing that activates defensive reasoning and status concerns. But the most productive approach to disagreement in critical thinking treats different perspectives as partial views of a complex reality, each potentially offering valuable insights. Thomas outlined a more productive approach to disagreement. 1. Perspective curiosity, approaching differences with genuine curiosity about what the other person sees that you might be missing. What are you seeing from your perspective that I might not be seeing from mine? 2. Identifying the roots of disagreement, exploring whether differences stem from different information, different interpretations, different assumptions, or different values. Are we disagreeing about the facts themselves, what they mean, the assumptions we're making, or the values we're prioritizing? 3. Finding the partial truth, looking for the legitimate insights in each perspective, even those you largely disagree with. Even though I see this differently overall, what valuable insights does their perspective offer? 4. Creating integrative alternatives, using the tension between different perspectives to generate new possibilities that incorporate insights from multiple viewpoints. How might we create an approach that addresses the core concerns from both our perspectives? This approach transformed how I handled a significant disagreement with a colleague about our product development priorities. Rather than trying to prove my perspective was correct and hers was flawed, I approached the conversation with genuine curiosity about what she was seeing that I might be missing. The resulting dialogue revealed that we were operating with different assumptions about user needs and market dynamics. By explicitly exploring these assumptions together, we developed a more nuanced understanding that led to a superior approach neither of us had initially envisioned. Emotional intelligence in critical conversations. The emotional dimension of interpersonal critical thinking cannot be overlooked, Thomas emphasized as our walk continued. Even with the best techniques, if we ignore the emotional currents in our conversations, we're unlikely to create conditions for optimal thinking. He described how emotions influence critical thinking conversations in several ways. 1. Emotional reactions to intellectual challenge. When ideas are questioned, people often experience emotional responses, feeling attacked, dismissed, or devalued, even when the questioning is purely intellectual in intent. 2. Identity and self-worth connections. Many perspectives are connected to people's sense of identity and self-worth, making their examination emotionally complex rather than purely cognitive. 3. Relationship history and patterns, past interactions create emotional context that influence how current conversations unfold, regardless of the specific content being discussed. 4. Power and status dynamics. Differences in organizational position, social standing, or perceived expertise create emotional undercurrents that affect willingness to engage in critical thinking. Thomas suggested practical approaches for addressing these emotional dimensions. Emotional validation, acknowledging the legitimacy of emotions without necessarily agreeing with the perspective they're connected to. I can see this issue is really important to you, and I understand why you feel strongly about it. Relational check-ins, explicitly addressing the relationship aspect of challenging conversations rather than focusing exclusively on content. I want to make sure our working relationship stays strong even as we explore these different perspectives. Metacommunication, talking about the conversation itself when emotional tensions arise rather than continuing to focus solely on the topic. I notice we seem to be getting frustrated with each other. Should we pause and talk about what's happening in our conversation? These approaches proved valuable when I needed to give critical feedback to a team member whose work wasn't meeting expectations. By acknowledging the emotional impact of the feedback while still maintaining clarity about performance issues, I was able to create a conversation that remained psychologically safe while addressing important concerns. From critical thinking to thinking partnerships. As we completed our circuit of the community garden, Thomas introduced a concept that brought together many aspects of our discussion. Perhaps the highest expression of interpersonal critical thinking, he suggested, is the development of genuine thinking partnerships, relationships specifically oriented toward helping each other think better. He described the characteristics of effective thinking partnerships. 1. Mutual commitment to improved thinking. Both people explicitly value better thinking and are committed to helping each other achieve it. 2. Complementary cognitive strengths. Partners recognize and value their different thinking styles, using them to create more complete understanding. 3. Established criticism rights. Clear agreements exist about how and when to challenge each other's thinking, creating permission for productive questioning. 4. Balanced advocacy and inquiry. Partners move fluidly between advocating their perspectives and inquiring into others' views. 5. Shared language of thinking. Common vocabulary and frameworks for discussing thinking processes and quality. These partnerships can be formal or informal, Thomas explained, but they're incredibly valuable for developing critical thinking capabilities. Having even one person with whom you can think through important issues with this level of quality can dramatically improve your decisions and understanding. I reflected on my professional and personal relationships, realizing I had elements of thinking partnerships, but few fully developed ones. With this framework in mind, I identified several relationships I could intentionally develop in this direction, including one with a colleague whose thinking style complemented my own in ways that had already led to several breakthrough insights when we collaborated. Integration, the community garden of thinking. As we prepare to leave, Thomas gestured to the flourishing community garden around us. This garden offers a perfect metaphor for interpersonal critical thinking at its best, he suggested. Different people bringing diverse knowledge, skills, and perspectives. Clear agreements about how to work together. Everyone benefiting from collective efforts while still maintaining their unique contributions. The whole becoming greater than the sum of its parts. He emphasized that, like gardening, interpersonal critical thinking requires both structure and flexibility. Frameworks that support productive interaction while allowing for organic emergence and growth. The most fruitful critical thinking doesn't happen in isolation, Thomas concluded. It emerges in relationships and communities where questioning is welcomed, diverse perspectives are valued, and people are committed to helping each other think better. At its best, it creates both better thinking and stronger relationships, a rare combination that enriches every aspect of our lives. As I left the community garden, watching people of different ages and backgrounds working together to nurture growing things, I carried with me a deeper appreciation for the interpersonal dimension of critical thinking. The techniques and approaches we discussed promised not just better decisions and clearer understanding, but richer, more productive relationships in both my professional and personal life. Chapter 9. Critical Thinking in a Complex World. The summer had reached its peak when Thomas and I met for what would be one of our final conversations. He suggested we meet at a busy urban park where multiple activities unfolded simultaneously. Children playing, musicians performing, vendors selling food, people exercising, all sharing the same dynamic space. This park, Thomas observed as we found seats near a central fountain, reminds me of the increasingly complex world we're navigating, multiple systems interacting simultaneously, constant change, diverse perspectives intersecting, all with limited predictability. Our final exploration focuses on applying critical thinking to this complexity. The topic felt particularly relevant. In both my professional and personal life, I'd been experiencing an increasing sense that traditional approaches to problems and decisions were insufficient for the complexity we were facing, from technological disruption to social change, from information overload to interconnected global challenges. Beyond complicated, understanding complex systems. First, Thomas began, we need to distinguish between complicated and complex situations as they require different thinking approaches. He explained the key differences. Complicated systems, multiple parts but fixed, understandable relationships. Predictable cause-effect relationships can be fully understood through analysis. Examples: mechanical engines, traditional software programs. Complex systems, dynamic, continually changing relationships. Emergent properties not predictable from components. Cannot be fully understood through analysis alone. Examples: ecosystems, markets, social networks, organizational cultures. Much of our traditional critical thinking is optimized for complicated rather than complex situations, Thomas noted. It assumes we can understand systems by analyzing their parts, that cause-effect relationships are stable and predictable, and that optimal solutions can be definitively determined. This insight resonated with challenges I'd been facing. Our organization had been applying traditional analytical approaches to increasingly complex market and technological environments, breaking problems into components, analyzing each separately, and assuming linear relationships. These approaches were yielding diminishing returns as the pace of change accelerated and interconnections multiplied. Complexity-adapted thinking, key principles. Navigating complexity requires adapting our critical thinking approaches, Thomas continued, gesturing toward the diverse activities simultaneously unfolding around us in the park. We need thinking that matches the nature of complex systems. He outlined several principles for complexity-adapted thinking. 1. Systems thinking: see interconnections and patterns rather than just isolated components. Focus on relationships between elements as much as the elements themselves. Thomas introduced techniques for developing systems thinking, creating visual maps of system relationships, identifying feedback loops and their effects, exploring how changes in one area might affect other parts of the system, looking for emergent properties that arise from interactions. I began applying this approach to a market analysis we were conducting, shifting from examining individual competitors and customers in isolation to mapping the ecosystem of relationships between them. This revealed patterns of influence and potential chain reactions we had previously missed. 2. Adaptive rather than optimal solutions. In truly complex environments, seeking optimal solutions often leads to fragility. Instead, develop approaches that can adapt to changing conditions and new information. Thomas suggested practices for creating adaptive solutions, building in feedback mechanisms that enable continuous learning, designing for modularity and flexibility rather than rigid efficiency, creating solution portfolios rather than single approaches, establishing clear principles to guide adaptation rather than fixed procedures. This perspective transformed our product development strategy. Rather than attempting to design the perfect feature set based on current analysis, we shifted toward creating a more adaptable platform with built-in feedback mechanisms and flexibility to evolve with emerging user needs. 3. probe-sense-respond approaches. When cause-effect relationships aren't clearly predictable, use experimental approaches that allow learning from system responses. Thomas explained the probe-sense-respond cycle. Create safe-to-fail experiments to probe the system. Sense how the system responds to these probes. Respond by amplifying successful patterns and dampening unsuccessful ones. Repeat with new experiments informed by previous learning. We applied this approach to our market expansion strategy, replacing our traditional comprehensive planning with a series of small market experiments designed to provide information about different regional dynamics. Each experiment was small enough to fail safely while providing valuable learning that informed subsequent approaches. 4. Pattern recognition beyond analysis. In complex systems, important insights often come from recognizing patterns that analysis alone might miss. Develop diverse methods for pattern detection and integration. Thomas suggested approaches for enhancing pattern recognition, incorporating diverse perspectives and expertise, using visual and spatial representations, developing comfort with ambiguity and partial information, creating reflection practices that allow intuitive pattern recognition to emerge. These techniques prove valuable when trying to understand shifting customer behaviors that didn't fit our existing analytical frameworks. By bringing together team members with diverse backgrounds and creating visual maps of emerging trends, we identified important pattern shifts that quantitative analysis alone had missed. Navigating complexity in practice, key challenges. Applying these approaches isn't always straightforward, Thomas acknowledged, watching a street performer juggle multiple objects simultaneously. Several specific challenges emerge when thinking critically about complex situations. He outlined these challenges and suggested approaches for addressing each. 1. Balancing analysis and synthesis. Traditional critical thinking emphasizes analysis, breaking things down into components. Complexity requires equal attention to synthesis, understanding how parts create wholes with emergent properties. Thomas suggested practices for strengthening synthetic thinking, regularly zooming between macro and micro perspectives, looking for properties that exist at the system level but not in individual components, exploring how different analytical insights might connect and interact, creating integrative models that combine multiple analytical perspectives. 2. Managing uncertainty and ambiguity. Complex systems involve inherent uncertainty that cannot be eliminated through more analysis. Effective thinking requires becoming comfortable operating with incomplete information and multiple possible interpretations. He offered approaches for working productively with uncertainty, developing explicit awareness of what is known, unknown, and unknowable, creating decision processes that acknowledge rather than suppress uncertainty, building robustness and adaptability into solutions rather than assuming predictability, using scenario thinking to explore multiple possible futures. 3. Balancing exploitation and exploration. Complex environments require both exploiting what works now and exploring new possibilities. Critical thinking needs to support both modes rather than privileging either stability or innovation. Thomas suggested practices for maintaining this balance, creating deliberate space for both optimization and experimentation, developing different thinking approaches for different contexts, building portfolios that include both established and experimental elements, recognizing when to shift emphasis based on environmental conditions. 4. Avoiding premature convergence. The pressure to reach conclusions and take action can lead to premature convergence on solutions before adequately understanding complex situations. He offered techniques for maintaining productive exploration, explicitly extending the divergent thinking phase before seeking convergence, creating permission structures for continued questioning even after apparent solutions emerge, designating devil's advocates to challenge emerging consensus, building in scheduled reevaluation points for major decisions. Collective intelligence, beyond individual critical thinking. Perhaps the most important aspect of navigating complexity Thomas suggested as we watched a group of street dancers coordinate their movements without apparent direction, is recognizing that complex challenges typically exceed individual cognitive capacity. They require forms of collective intelligence. He explained how collective intelligence emerges from collaborative thinking arrangements that allow multiple perspectives and capabilities to combine in ways that transcend individual limitations. The quality of our collective thinking doesn't just depend on individual critical thinking skills, but on how effectively those individual capabilities are organized and integrated. Thomas outlined approaches for enhancing collective intelligence. 1. Cognitive diversity, bringing together people with different thinking styles, disciplinary backgrounds, and lived experiences creates a broader cognitive foundation for understanding complex systems. 2. Effective information sharing, creating systems and norms that ensure relevant information is accessible across boundaries rather than trapped in organizational or disciplinary silos. 3. Integrative practices, developing specific processes for synthesizing diverse perspectives into coherent understanding rather than simply aggregating individual views. 4. Psychological safety, establishing environments where people can express uncertainty, question assumptions, and challenge prevailing views without fear of negative consequences. 5. Shared mental models, building common frameworks and language that allow effective coordination while preserving valuable differences in perspective. I realized how these principles could transform our organization's approach to strategic planning. Rather than relying primarily on executive analysis filtered through hierarchical decision processes, we could create more dynamic integration of frontline insights, customer feedback, technical expertise, and leadership perspective. Personal practices for complexity navigation. As our conversation continued, Thomas shifted focus to personal practices for navigating complexity. Beyond analytical techniques and collective approaches, he suggested, there are personal capabilities and habits that enhance your ability to think critically about complex situations. He outlined several key practices. 1. Developing comfort with uncertainty. Cultivate the capacity to function effectively without complete information or certainty. Learn to distinguish productive discomfort that leads to growth from counterproductive anxiety that impairs thinking. 2. Maintaining multiple perspectives. Practice holding contradictory viewpoints in mind simultaneously without immediately resolving the tension. Learn to see situations through multiple conceptual lenses rather than defaulting to familiar frameworks. 3. Balancing patience and action. Develop judgment about when to allow understanding to emerge from continued observation versus when to act despite incomplete understanding. Learn to recognize when additional analysis yields diminishing returns. 4. Cultivating provisional thinking. Practice holding conclusions as working hypotheses rather than fixed truths. Develop the habit of regularly revisiting and revising your understanding as new information emerges. 5. Engaging in regular reflection. Create consistent practices for stepping back from immediate engagement to see larger patterns and dynamics. Develop the discipline of questioning your own thinking even when not externally prompted. These personal practices resonated deeply. I realized that while I had developed many analytical critical thinking skills, navigating complexity required additional capacities, particularly comfort with uncertainty and the ability to maintain multiple perspectives without premature resolution. Integration, the living system of critical thinking. As our meeting drew to a close, Thomas gestured to the park around us, now bathed in late afternoon sunlight, still bustling with diverse activities operating at different rhythms and scales. Critical thinking in a complex world, he suggested, is ultimately about developing a living relationship with reality rather than attempting to reduce it to manageable models. It's about dancing with systems rather than trying to control them entirely. He emphasized that this approach doesn't abandon the analytical rigor of traditional critical thinking, but expands it to include additional dimensions. We need analysis and synthesis, rigor and creativity, individual insight and collective intelligence, focused attention, and peripheral awareness. The most powerful thinking integrates these seeming opposites rather than choosing between them. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Thomas offered a final observation. Perhaps the deepest wisdom in navigating complexity is recognizing that our understanding will always be partial and evolving. Critical thinking becomes not a path to final answers, but a continuing journey of discovery, one that's challenging and uncertain, but also deeply rewarding. As I left the park that evening, watching the diverse activities gradually transition into nighttime patterns, I carried with me a profound appreciation for both the challenges and possibilities of applying critical thinking to complex realities. The approaches Thomas had shared offered not simplistic solutions, but a richer engagement with the fascinating complexity of our world, professional, personal, and beyond. Epilogue: the continuous journey. A year had passed since my final regular meeting with Thomas. The leaves were turning once again as I made my way to the cafe where our conversations had begun. He had suggested we reconnect to reflect on the journey and share how critical thinking had continued to evolve in our lives. The cafe looked much the same warm lighting, the gentle hum of conversations, the rain tapping against windows. Yet I entered it as a different person than the frustrated professional who had first sat down with Thomas all those months ago. Thomas greeted me with a warm smile, looking much the same with his well-worn sweater and thoughtful eyes. After ordering our usual drinks, we settled into a corner table, a familiar comfort in the ritual. So, he began, "How has your relationship with critical thinking evolved since our conversations ended?" I took a moment to gather my thoughts. "It's become both simpler and more complex," I replied. "Simpler in that many of the approaches we discussed have become more natural, less effortful. I find myself questioning assumptions, considering multiple perspectives, and integrating emotional awareness without having to consciously remind myself to do so." Thomas nodded encouragingly. "But it's also become more complex," I continued. "I've discovered that critical thinking isn't a destination, but a continuous journey. Each new understanding opens questions I hadn't previously considered. Each improvement in my thinking reveals new areas for growth." "That's the paradox of wisdom," Thomas smiled. "The more we develop it, the more we recognize how much more there is to learn. From techniques to integration." I shared how my application of critical thinking had evolved from conscious technique to more integrated practice. The questioning approaches, perspective-shifting exercises, and emotional awareness practices we had explored had gradually become less like separate tools and more like aspects of a unified approach to understanding. "I notice you're using fewer technical terms now when you describe your thinking," Thomas observed. "That's often a sign of deeper integration, when the explicit frameworks become implicit guides rather than conscious techniques." This observation resonated. Where I had once needed to explicitly remind myself to question assumptions or consider alternative perspectives, these approaches had become more intuitive. The boundaries between analytical and intuitive thinking, between emotional and logical processing, had become more permeable. "It reminds me of learning any complex skill," I reflected. "At first, you consciously apply techniques step by step. Eventually, they become integrated into fluid practice where you're no longer thinking about the techniques themselves, but simply engaging directly with the challenges before you." The ripple effects. Thomas asked about how my critical thinking journey had affected different areas of my life. I shared how the impacts had radiated outward in expanding circles. In my professional life, I had been promoted to a leadership position where I was now helping others develop similar capabilities. The team I led had developed a reputation for both innovative thinking and sound judgment, combining creative exploration with rigorous evaluation in ways that generated better solutions to complex challenges. In my relationships, I found deeper connections emerging from improved capacity to understand different perspectives, navigate disagreements productively, and integrate both emotional and analytical understanding. Some relationships had deepened significantly, while a few had naturally faded as our mutual capacity for thoughtful engagement evolved differently. In my community involvement, I had begun facilitating dialogue sessions on contested local issues, creating spaces where diverse perspectives could be explored with both intellectual rigor and emotional intelligence. These sessions had helped transform several potentially divisive issues into opportunities for collaborative problem solving. What strikes me, Thomas observed, is how your development of critical thinking has benefited not just yourself, but rippled outward to influence others. That's often the mark of genuine growth. It naturally expands beyond the individual. The continuing challenges. Our conversation wasn't just about successes, however. I also shared the ongoing challenges I encountered in applying critical thinking consistently. In emotionally charged situations, I still sometimes find myself reverting to reactive patterns rather than thoughtful responses. When I'm tired or stressed, my capacity for perspective taking and assumption questioning diminishes. And there remain areas where my unexamined assumptions continue to limit my understanding in ways I'm only gradually recognizing. Thomas nodded with understanding. That's the human condition, he said gently. Critical thinking isn't about achieving perfection, but about continuing development. The fact that you notice these limitations is itself evidence of growth. He suggested that recognizing these challenges was actually a sign of progress. When we first began our conversations, you were concerned primarily with applying critical thinking to external problems and other people's thinking. Now you're equally attuned to the subtleties and limitations in your own thinking processes. That internal awareness is perhaps the most valuable aspect of critical thinking development. The deeper integration. As our conversation continued, we explored how critical thinking had become integrated with other aspects of development. I found that my critical thinking journey has become inseparable from deeper questions of purpose, meaning, and values I shared. The same skills that help me analyze complex business problems also help me explore what truly matters in life, what kind of person I want to become, and how I can contribute meaningfully to the world around me. Thomas smiled with evident satisfaction. That's the natural evolution, he suggested. Critical thinking isn't ultimately about being clever or right. It's about developing wisdom, the capacity to navigate life's complexity with both clarity and compassion, both analytical rigor and heartfelt understanding. He explained how the highest development of critical thinking naturally converges with other aspects of human development: emotional maturity, ethical sensitivity, purpose alignment, and authentic connection. At its foundation, critical thinking is about seeing more clearly, penetrating through confusion, bias, and limitation to perceive reality more accurately. That clarity naturally expands to include not just external facts, but internal truths, not just logical relationships, but meaningful ones. Passing it forward. As our meeting drew to a close, I share my growing interest in helping others develop their own critical thinking capabilities. I find myself naturally wanting to share these approaches with colleagues, friends, and community members, I explained, not in a prescriptive way, but through asking the kinds of questions that create space for deeper thinking, modeling the integration of analytical and emotional understanding, and creating environments where collaborative exploration can flourish. Thomas seemed particularly pleased by this development. Teaching others is one of the most powerful ways to deepen your own understanding, he observed. In helping others develop their thinking, you'll discover new dimensions of your own. He suggested that my desire to share these approaches was a natural extension of the journey. When we experience the benefits of more integrated thinking, we naturally want to contribute to others' development. Not because we have all the answers, but because we've discovered questions and approaches that open valuable possibilities. The eternal beginning. As we prepared to part, Thomas offered a final reflection. What you're discovering, he said, is that critical thinking isn't a linear path with a clear destination. It's a spiral of continuous development, where each level of understanding creates the foundation for new questions and deeper exploration. He suggested that the most profound aspect of critical thinking is this quality of eternal beginning. The recognition that each answer creates the context for more nuanced questions. Each insight reveals new horizons for exploration. The master critical thinker, Thomas smiled, is paradoxically the one who remains most deeply aware of how much they don't know. Not in a discouraging way, but in a way that maintains perpetual curiosity and openness to new understanding. As we stepped outside the cafe, the autumn leaves swirled around us in the gentle breeze, a perfect metaphor for the continuing cycles of growth and renewal. "Thank you," I said sincerely, "not just for the techniques and approaches you've shared, but for accompanying me on this journey of discovery." Thomas clasped my hand warmly. "The journey continues," he replied simply, "for both of us." As I walked away, watching the leaves dance in the wind, I carried with me not a sense of completion, but of perpetual beginning. The recognition that critical thinking wasn't a destination I had reached, but a continuing journey of exploration, one that would continue to unfold in new and unexpected ways throughout my life. The questions I now held were richer than the answers I had initially sought, and in that richness lay the true gift of the critical thinking journey. Not certainty, but an ever-deepening engagement with the fascinating complexity of existence. As I turned the corner, I smiled at the realization that this ending was, in truth, just another beginning. The next chapter of this continuous journey was already unfolding, bringing new challenges, new insights, and new opportunities to apply and expand the integrated thinking I had begun to develop. Whatever lay ahead, I now had not just tools, but a more fundamental capacity, the ability to engage with life's questions with both rigorous clarity and open-hearted wisdom. And in that integration lay a potential not just for better decisions or clearer understanding, but for a richer, more meaningful engagement with the full spectrum of human experience. The journey continued. Final reflections. Looking back on the path I've shared with you through these chapters, I'm struck by how differently I now understand critical thinking compared to when I first met Thomas. What began as a search for tools to solve specific problems evolved into a much richer exploration of how we can engage with life's complexity more wisely. The approaches and insights I've described aren't a formula or a definitive system. They're invitations to your own journey of discovery. Each reader will naturally connect more strongly with certain aspects based on their own experiences, challenges, and learning style. The beauty of critical thinking as we've explored it lies precisely in this personalization. The way these principles and practices can be adapted to your unique circumstances and integrated with your particular strengths and growth areas. If you take only one thing from this book, I hope it's the recognition that critical thinking isn't just an academic skill, but a living practice that can enrich every dimension of your life. It's not about being more clever than others or always having the right answers. It's about approaching life's questions, from the practical to the profound, with both intellectual rigor and genuine openness. In a world that often pushes us toward either rigid certainty or passive acceptance, the journey of developing integrated critical thinking offers a middle path, one where we can hold strong convictions while remaining open to growth, where we can analyze rigorously while honoring emotional wisdom, where we can think independently while engaging deeply with diverse perspectives. My conversations with Thomas continue to evolve in my mind, sparked anew when I face challenging situations or unexplored questions. The approaches we discussed have become companions on my journey, not as rigid techniques, but as flexible guides that help me navigate life's complexity with greater wisdom and clarity. I invite you to make these approaches your own, to experiment, adapt, and discover what works in your unique context. The insights that matter most aren't the ones I've written here, but the ones you'll discover through your own exploration and application. The path of critical thinking is endless, with each insight creating the context for new questions, each moment of clarity revealing new horizons for exploration. It's a journey that can last a lifetime, continuously deepening and expanding as we grow. I wish you well on your own journey of discovery. May you find, as I have, that the questions become richer, the insights more nuanced, and the engagement with life's complexity more rewarding with each step along the path. The journey continues. For all of us,